My son didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam a door. He didn't accuse or criticize. He simply sighed and said the sentence that would unravel the holiday in a way far quieter than anger ever could. Christmas is just too complicated this year, Mom. I know, Esquire. Too complicated. 2 words that carried the weight of distance. Without ever admitting it, I felt something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a chair, subtly moved away from a table I once sat at without question. He didn't list reasons. He didn't explain. He didn't ask how I felt. He just assumed I would understand, and I did. At least outwardly. I nodded, smiled, softened the blow by absorbing it. Because that's what mothers do when holidays become negotiations instead of traditions. But in the quiet after, I realized something. Christmas wasn't complicated. I was. Or rather, my presence was. And that realization was the beginning of a heartbreak no one noticed. When my son was young, the word complicated belonged to jigsaw puzzles, high school algebra, and fixing the sprinkler system. It was never a word I expected to collide with Christmas. Christmas had always been, I know, simpler. Not in the sense of lacking effort. I worked hard. There were recipes, decorations, stockings, traditions built carefully, like fragile ornaments, handed down from memory. But the simplicity came from certainty. Certainty that he would be here. Certainty that family meant gathering. Certainty that holidays were anchor points, not negotiations. Back then, the only complications were, does the tree lean a little to the left? Did we remember batteries for the toys? Did the dog eat the gingerbread house again? Complications we laughed about. Complications we shared. But children grow. Lives expand. Schedules tighten. And somewhere between adulthood and independence, words begin to change shape. Complicated stopped meaning difficult. In way was look at it. It began to mean inconvenient, end quote. And eventually, it became code for something unspoken. We don't want to say no directly, but we want you to understand anyway. It happened on a Thursday in November. I remember because I was peeling apples for a pie recipe he used to love. My son called. Not from excitement, not from anticipation, but from a place of practicality. He said hello, asked about the weather, mentioned the kids' school play. Then, casually, almost gently, as if softening the phrasing might lessen the meaning, he said, "Mom, Christmas is just too complicated this year. Thanks for watching." Too complicated. 2 words, spoken with the tone people use when they want to avoid guilt, but also avoid inclusion. I waited. Not for an apology, not for an explanation, just for clarity. But clarity did not come. He did not say, "We want to spend it alone this year." He did not say, "It's too far to travel." He did not say, "We're overwhelmed." He said, "Complicated." Because complicated does not accuse. It does not declare. It does not confront. It simply evades. And evasion, in its politest form, still wounds. I smiled through the phone, a habit I had mastered, long before this moment. "Oh," I said, as if the word explained everything. He exhaled, relieved. I had made it easy. I always made it easy. For years, I softened the blows before they landed. I absorbed the hurt before it bruised. I mistook placating for grace. I mistook silence for strength. But as the call ended and the kitchen grew quiet, I realized something small, but devastatingly clear. Christmas wasn't complicated. I was. Or rather, My presence was not unwanted outright, not rejected loudly, just complicating. Too many expectations, too many obligations, too much tradition, too much history, too much. And that is the cruelness of the word complicated. It shifts blame onto circumstance, when circumstance is merely the scapegoat. In the days that followed, I replayed the conversation. Complicated began to echo in the simplest moments. Complicated when I passed the aisle of ornaments. Complicated when I looked at the empty stockings. Complicated when I saw families choosing pine trees together. And slowly, I began to understand a language I had never intended to learn, the language of adulthood, with its softened rejections and euphemisms for avoidance, the language that turns "I don't want to" into "arg-it." It's complicated, the language that assumes a mother will understand without being told the truth outright, and the language that turns holidays from shared rituals into logistical burdens. For him, complicated meant schedules, children, travel, traditions, expectations. For me, complicated meant excluded, or, more painfully, optional. I think that is what struck me hardest. Not that he chose a different kind of Christmas, but that he believed I would adjust, without question, that I would volunteer to shrink, so his world could expand, that my heart would absorb disappointment, so his hands could remain clean. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. Complicated said it for him. In that moment, I did not confront him. I did not ask questions. I did not reveal the sting. I simply agreed, quietly, willingly, automated, because I thought that was love. I thought that protecting him from discomfort was the noble thing to do, but in reality, I protected him by sacrificing myself. And in that sacrifice, I taught him that complicated was a valid reason to exclude me politely. Looking back now, I see the subtle cruelty in polite avoidance. It does not wound loudly, it wounds quietly. In a way, you feel foolish acknowledging, because who challenges a word like complicated? Who admits they want to be chosen instead of excused? Who demands a clearer rejection than the soft one offered? We do not. Mothers do not. We swallow the ache and call it understanding. But understanding is not acceptance. It is capitulation. And capitulation is not grace. It is defeat, disguised as patience. Complicated became code. Code for not this year, not with you, not like before. Code for don't ask, don't push, don't hope. And I heard the code. I understood it. I obeyed it. But deep inside, I also recognized the first fracture, a fracture, not loud enough to break us, but deep enough to change us. Because once complicated enters the vocabulary of a holiday, simplicity rarely returns. Unease is not dramatic. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It does not make demands or announce itself with urgency. Unease simply lingers, quiet, persistent, patient. It settles in the corners of ordinary days and waits for you to notice it. After my son said Christmas was too complicated, I told myself I understood. I rehearsed explanations on his behalf because he didn't offer any. Work schedules, kids' activities, travel costs, weather, all reasonable, all plausible, all comfortable lies I crafted to protect him From the truth, he didn't choose to include me. He chose not to. And the unease crept in, not in the moment itself. I was too busy masking my hurt with practiced understanding. It arrived later, when the house was still, when the phone had gone silent, when I walked past the hall closet and my hand brushed against the box of ornaments that would remain untouched. It arrived when I wasn't performing, and without performance, there was nothing to soften the realization. Unease speaks softly, but sharply. It asked questions I didn't want to hear. Why didn't he ask what I wanted? Why didn't he ask how I felt? When did my presence become optional? And why did I pretend? It didn't hurt. I tried to silence it with distraction. Cleaning, organizing, reading, walking, but unease is not deterred by movement. It travels with you. It sat beside me. As I grocery shopped, my cart smaller than usual because I wasn't preparing for a meal that once filled every seat. It lingered in the aisles with the wrapping paper and ribbon. It echoed softly as I passed families, choosing trees, arguing over sizes, laughing about lights, not loudly, not bitterly, just present, a quiet throb, a reminder. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe this year is different. Maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe next year will be better. Maybe. The most dangerous refuge for unease is maybe keeps you suspended between hope and denial. Maybe lets you cling to possibility while avoiding truth. Maybe is how mothers justify exclusion without naming it. And so I sat in the living room one afternoon with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, listening to the clock ticking felt louder than usual. Time has a way of amplifying unease. Each tick felt like a question. How long will you pretend this doesn't matter? How long will you shrink to avoid confrontation? How long will you let complicated define your place? The unease also arrived in quieter moments, not of absence, but presence. When my son called about unrelated things, updates on work, the kids' soccer game, a new recipe they tried, I listened. I smiled. I asked questions. I offered support. But beneath the conversation, beneath the laughter, beneath the familiar warmth, lay something else. Distance. Not in miles, in meaning. His life had shifted without me noticing. Or maybe without me wanting to notice. And unease whispered. He did not think your presence was essential. Not this year. Maybe not anymore. And I hated that the whisper felt true. What I struggled with most was not the absence of an invitation. It was the absence of honest conversation. If he had said, "We want a quiet Christmas this year," or "We need space to build our own traditions," or even, "We're choosing something different," I could have processed it. I could have mourned it. I could have understood it. But complicated is a word that hides. It obscures. It softens. It leaves you questioning rather than knowing. And unease thrives in unanswered questions. I didn't confront him. Not because I was weak. Not because I didn't care. But because I feared the answer. I feared confirmation of what unease suggested, that I was no longer central, that the holiday no longer needed my hands, that tradition no longer required my home, that presence no longer equaled belonging. I feared he might say these things out loud, and once spoken, they could never be unsaid. So I kept the unease to myself. And like all unspoken hurts, it grew. It grew while I sorted laundry. In silence. It grew while I fetched the mail from an empty box. It grew while neighbors strung lights, and I pretended I was planning to do the same. The ache was not overwhelming. It was subtle, and subtle hurts often last the longest because they are easy to hide, even from yourself. In the mirror, I practiced neutrality. No bitterness, no resentment, just resignation. But inside, where unease lives, I knew something had shifted. Complicated was not the cause. Complicated was the excuse, and unease was the translation. It translated, we want a holiday without the weight of obligation. We want joy without complication. We want space without guilt. We want distance without naming it. I didn't cry. Not yet. Tears require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires truth. I wasn't ready, so unease stayed, like a guest who arrives early and refuses to leave. And though I pretended everything was fine, smiling through conversations, humming along to carols, shopping for gifts, I wasn't sure I'd deliver. The quiet voice inside me kept repeating, Christmas isn't complicated, but something is, and I was beginning to fear it might be us. Silence is rarely the absence of words. It is the presence of restraint. After my son said Christmas was too complicated, and after the unease settled in like a cold draft beneath a closed door, I found myself standing at the edge of a familiar crossroads. Speak or stay silent. Ask or absorb. I chose silence. Not because I didn't have questions, not because I didn't feel hurt, not because I lacked the courage to express myself. I chose silence because expressing the ache felt more dangerous than enduring it. Silence, in its way, felt like control. A small, private territory I could still govern. The first test came quickly. A weekend lunch I attended at my son's home. Before the holiday, before Florida became the destination I wouldn't see, his wife, Sarah, was setting the table. She used the phrase casually, like dusting crumbs from a countertop. Since this Christmas will be simple. Simple. Another word chosen carefully. Not complicated. Not difficult. Simple. I felt the shift. A linguistic dance. Complicated framed the exclusion as an accident. Simple framed it as an improvement. And I stood there, holding a dish towel, watching her rearrange forks and plates, rearrange narratives, rearrange holiday expectations. My instinct was to say, simple doesn't mean without me, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled with the practiced expression of someone who has learned that politeness cushions discomfort for others. Silence protected them from discomfort, but it did not protect me from truth. Silence also appeared in our phone calls. Every conversation was an exercise in omission. He would describe the kids' school pageant, the extended weekend plans, the Florida rental with room for 4, and I would respond politely while ignoring the detail that mattered most. 4, not 5, not 6. 4, a number that did not include me. I learned to speak around the wound, to ask about travel arrangements without acknowledging their implications, to discuss gifts without asking where they'd be opened, to comment on the weather without naming the storm inside me. Silence became script, a script written by decades of maternal reflex. Don't burden them. Don't pressure them. Don't cry. Don't complain. Don't complicate what they claim is complicated. I silenced myself for a reason. Speaking meant risking confirmation. What if they said, yes, Mom, we want a Christmas without obligation. If we weren't a day, yes, Mom, we need space to create our own traditions. Abel stay. Yes, Mom, it's time for us, not you. I won't cat it. Silence protected me from those possibilities. So I chose it, until I began to realize silence is not neutrality. Silence communicates. It says, I accept this. I agree with this. This doesn't hurt me. You may continue. And when silence speaks long enough, people mistake it for consent. I also chose silence because noise, even honest noise, has consequences. Mothers know this. Daughters learn it. Wives perfect it. Noise disrupts. Noise demands accountability. Noise forces confrontation. And holidays, with their fragile expectations and delicate egos, are allergic to confrontation. So silence was the safer choice for them, but not for me. The moment I understood the cost of my silence came unexpectedly. I was at the grocery store, lifting a turkey I knew I wouldn't roast. A woman beside me reached for marshmallows and sighed. Every year, I say I'll simplify, and every year, I don't. Christmas is complicated, isn't it? And devout. End quote. Her words were casual, a stranger's complaint, to no one in particular, but I felt pierced. Because she meant the bustle, the recipes, the travel, not exclusion, not absence, not erasure. Her complicated was universal. Mine was not. And I realized silence had tricked me into believing my hurt was trivial. But hurt isn't measured by volume. It's measured by impact. There were moments I nearly broke the silence when he showed me the Florida rental with beachfront views that used to belong to my living room windows and the glow of fireplace stockings. When the children asked, "Will Grandma come?" I was cried, and Sarah answered, without looking at me, "Not this year. It's too complicated." I could have spoken. I could have said, "It wouldn't be complicated if you wanted me there." And her life says, but silence held me. Part protection, part habit, part fear. Fear of confirming what I only suspected. Fear of naming what I wasn't ready to accept. Fear of losing what remained, even if what remained was thin. But silence did something else, too. It slowly revealed the truth beneath the euphemisms. Complicated meant inconvenient. Simple meant without me. Space meant of distance. Tradition meant burden. And my silence did not change those truths. It only delayed my reckoning with them. Looking back, I see my silence not as weakness, but as transition. I wasn't ready to fight. I wasn't ready to grieve. I wasn't ready to redefine what Christmas meant. I needed silence to process, to gather strength, to watch, to understand. But silence also allowed something unintended. It let them believe their decision did not hurt me. Silence protected them from guilt and isolated me in pain. Still, in that silence, a seed was planted, a realization that complicated was not the story. It was the cover, and silence was no longer a shield. It was a choice, one whose consequences I could no longer ignore. The silence I chose would lead to the truth I could not avoid, and in that truth, the fracture would begin to widen. There is a moment in every mother's life when she realizes something has shifted, not loudly, not cruelly, but unmistakably. For me, the moment arrived slowly, not with a declaration, but with omissions, not with rejection, but with rearrangements. And gradually, I saw it. I had become optional, not unwanted, not disliked, not excluded explicitly, just optional. Optional in plans, optional in traditions, optional in presence. A choice, not a certainty. A variable, not a constant. It was the first time in decades my role was not assumed. Optional began with language, Small phrases delivered casually. If you want to, if it works for you. No pressure. We'll figure it out. Language built to soften decisions, but also to distance responsibility. Optional is disguised as kindness. It leaves room for you to bow out so they don't have to. Optional is inclusion without commitment. Optional is presence without necessity. Optional is invitation without desire. And I felt it. In every softened sentence, it continued in logistics. I noticed how they planned. There were 4 plane tickets, 4 seats in the rented SUV, 4 beds in the beachfront condo, not 5, not 6, 4. And yes, they could have adjusted. Yes, they could have rearranged. Yes, they could have chosen differently. But they didn't. Because rearrangements are for essentials, not for options. Optional means adjustments are inconveniences, and no one rearranges for what is optional. Optional crept into conversations. When they talked about the holiday, they used pronouns that used to include me. We're spending Christmas in Florida. 80 no, we found a great condo. A tell for us. We'll keep it simple this year. Once, we meant all of us. Now, we meant them. And I, quietly, without announcement, shifted into you. It's braided autocally. You'll have a relaxing week. End quote. You can rest. With maybe higher, you'll enjoy the peace and quiet. Gold lining. You became the address for isolation. We became the label for family. Optional is not about absence. It is about grammar. Language becomes the architect of distance. Optional appeared in assumptions. They assumed I would understand. They assumed I would adjust. They assumed I would accept. They assumed I would not protest. They assumed I would create my own plans, quiet ones, that did not interfere. Optional people are expected to adapt, not to question, not to complicate, not to require change. Optional people are expected to smile and say, "It's fine," and quote, "It is to any man." Optional is the absence of obligation on their part and the presence of restraint on mine. But perhaps the most painful part was how natural it felt to them. My son did not call to ask what I hoped for. He called to inform, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, out of familiarity. For years, I trained him to assume I could be placed last, without consequence. I taught him that my flexibility was infinite, that my sacrifices were invisible, that my needs were negligible. Optional did not happen overnight. It was built on decades of "I'll make it work." Everyone. Optional was the cost of always accommodating. Optional was the consequence of never asking. Optional was the legacy of silence. The realization struck hardest the evening I sat at my dining room table, a table once crowded with elbows and laughter and half-finished conversations. I set one place, out of habit. Then I cleared it, out of recognition. A single place setting, at a table built for 6, is a portrait of optional, not absence, not solitude. Optional, a placeholder, without a place. It's a strange thing to be optional. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't reject. It forgets. It doesn't remove. It replaces quietly. Optional is not dramatic enough to draw sympathy. Optional is not tragic enough to demand intervention. Optional is the ache you can't justify, because how do you explain that you were not pushed out, only not included? How do you grieve a space you once held when it is still technically yours, just not offered freely? How do you name a heartbreak built on maybes and suggestions instead of declarations. Optional is a wound without evidence. And yet, optional transforms. It changes how you move, how you speak, how you remain silent. It makes you smaller, quieter, less certain. You scale back invitations. You reduce expectations. You rearrange plans around possibilities instead of priorities. Optional teaches you not to assume. Optional teaches you to prepare for absence. Optional teaches you to expect less and pretend it's fine. That Christmas came to represent a truth I had never named. A mother is central until she isn't. Tradition is unshakable until it shakes. Belonging is permanent until it becomes conditional. And presence is assumed until it becomes optional. But here is the part that surprised me. Optional was not merely what they made me. It was what I allowed. Optional was the role I accepted when I chose silence. Optional was the place I remained in when I didn't ask. Optional was the identity I slipped into when I hid the ache instead of speaking it. Optional was my complicity, a truth I didn't want to face. And yet, the moment I recognized it, I understood. Optional was not a verdict. It was a turning point. Because what is optional can be declined or reclaimed. Optional was the threshold. And beyond it lay the question, would I remain? A choice they made. Or become a choice I made? The answer would come later. But recognition, painful, quiet, necessary, began here. The day I realized I had become optional. For weeks, I told myself the story was simple. My son said Christmas was too complicated, and I was hurt. Hurt at being excluded. Hurt at being optional. Hurt at the shift I didn't see coming. But pain, I've learned, is rarely about the moment that causes it. It is about the history beneath it. And when I finally stopped replaying the words too complicated and began asking myself why they cut so deeply, I realized something much harder. This was not just about Christmas. It was about identity. It was about shifting roles I never prepared for. It was about expectations I didn't know I had. And it was about the unspoken truth. Beneath decades of motherhood, I had built a version of myself that only felt meaningful when I was needed. The first layer of realization was about tradition. I didn't just lose a holiday. I lost a ritual that had become a symbol of belonging. My son's decision wasn't simply logistical. It was generational. He wanted a Christmas that reflected his life, not mine, his traditions, his rhythm, his definitions of meaningful. I didn't realize how tightly I clung to the idea that holidays preserved history. To me, tradition was continuity. To him, tradition was constraint. And when I finally acknowledged this, I saw the fracture differently. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting the narrative that tradition must stay the same to remain valuable. But because I had anchored my worth to the role of tradition keeper, his need for change felt like a rejection of me. It wasn't. It only felt that way because I didn't know where I stood. Outside of tradition, the second layer was about time. When children are young, time is given to parents, freely, in abundance. As they grow, time becomes scarce. Every hour must be negotiated. Every holiday must be shared. Every choice carries implications. The truth I resisted was this. Christmas wasn't complicated. Time was. He was balancing his own family, his in-laws, his children's desires, the demands of adulthood. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that growing up doesn't stop when your child turns 18. It continues. It complicates. It demands. He wasn't placing me last. He was placing me among many. And for the first time, I was no longer the default. That shifting is inevitable, but inevitable doesn't mean painless. The third realization was the hardest. This wasn't just about losing tradition. It was about losing control. For years, I shaped Christmas. I hosted. I planned. I decided menus, schedules, rituals. Control disguised itself as care. And when I stepped back, or rather, when I was not invited to step in, I felt disoriented. Not because I wanted power. I never saw myself that way. But because control had given me purpose. Without control, who was I? A guest? An observer? A participant? Without authority? I never realized how much authority I held until it was gone, and losing it felt like losing identity. The fourth layer was about assumptions. I assumed I would always be central. I assumed traditions would stay the same. I assumed my children would value what I valued. I assumed inclusion was automatic. But assumptions are fragile foundations. They crack under the weight of change. And when they crumble, they reveal something uncomfortable. We don't just grieve what we lost, we grieve the belief that we would never lose it. My pain was tied, not to the decision itself, but to the shattering of assumption. The fifth realization was about silence. I believed silence was grace, that not speaking kept peace. But silence didn't preserve peace, it preserved ignorance. By not asking questions, I allowed him to believe I was fine. By not expressing hurt, I allowed him to believe his choices had no impact. By not naming exclusion, I allowed complicated to remain unchallenged. My silence taught him I didn't need consideration. My silence taught him I would always adjust. And in doing so, I reinforced the very dynamic that wounded me. My pain wasn't just about his choice, it was about my silence. Before the choice was made, while it happened, and after it settled. Then came the most surprising realization. This wasn't only about what he did, it was about what I feared. I feared that if I confronted him, the truth would be worse than the silence. I feared that if I asked questions, the answers would confirm my deepest worry. I was no longer essential. I feared that if I expressed needs, I would be seen as demanding. I feared that if I showed hurt, I would seem weak. And so the fear became the architect of my silence, and silence became the architect of exclusion. And yet, beneath all these realizations, something deeper emerged. This was about love. Not a love lost, but a love evolving. He did not exclude me because he stopped loving me. He excluded me because he assumed my love was unconditional enough to absorb the change. He assumed I would understand. He assumed I would bend. He assumed my presence was safe to let go of, without consequence. He assumed my love could withstand the weight of his autonomy. And in a painful way, he was right. But love is not the same as absence of need. Love does not erase boundaries. Love does not silence hurt. Love should not require disappearing. What I realized is that this Christmas forced a reckoning, not with love, but with the shape of love. In a new season of life, love as a mother is not the same as love as a grandmother. Love in our 40 seconds is not the same as love in our 70 seconds. Love in tradition is not the same as love in transition. And if love cannot evolve, it becomes burden. If love cannot make space, it becomes obligation. If love cannot speak, it becomes resentment. If love cannot change, it breaks. This was not about Christmas. It was about evolution. His, mine, ours. It was about the moment. A family shifts, from parents leading to children deciding. It was about the uncomfortable truth that motherhood changes long before we admit it. It was about the fragile border between being essential and being optional. And it was about learning, slowly and painfully, that the end of one role is not the end of love, it is the beginning of another. A role without tradition, without control, without assumption. A role built on choice, not obligation. A role built on presence, not power. This Christmas wasn't a rejection, it was a transition. I didn't see it then, but understanding began here, in the realization of what this was really about. I didn't feel calm after everything went quiet. If anything, I felt untethered. The days that followed didn't bring relief. They brought a strange kind of pause, the kind that arrives when a rhythm ends, but nothing replaces it. I woke up early out of habit. My body still expected something to respond to, a message, a request, a very presented, a small problem that needed smoothing. There was nothing. The quiet wasn't heavy. It wasn't peaceful either. It was unfinished. I made coffee and stood at the counter longer than usual, not thinking, just waiting for the feeling to settle. It didn't. For years, my days had been shaped by anticipation, not excitement, readiness. Someone might need me. Someone might call. Plans might change. That possibility had given my time direction. Without it, the hours felt loose. I checked my phone without realizing I was doing it, then checked it again, as if the second time might tell me something different. It didn't. I began noticing how often I moved through the house, looking for something to do that didn't actually need doing, straightening things that were already straight, wiping counters that were already clean, motion without purpose. That's when I realized something unsettling. I didn't miss conversation. I missed being expected. Being useful had been my structure. Not my identity, but close enough that the difference blurred. Without that role, I felt oddly transparent. Still present, but no longer accounted for. I drove one afternoon just to feel movement again. Not to clear my head, not to escape, just to remind myself that time was passing. That was when I turned toward the cabin, not because it meant safety, not because it promised clarity, because it was familiar. I hadn't noticed how rarely I went there, without a reason. When I arrived, nothing greeted me. No rush of memory, no comfort, just stillness. I sat and waited for something to happen inside me. Nothing did. The quiet didn't explain itself. It didn't offer meaning. It simply showed me how much of my life had been arranged around someone else's needs. I had thought endurance meant strength. That patience was proof of stability. But sitting there, with no one requiring anything of me, I felt exposed, not empowered. Who was I when I wasn't holding something together? That question didn't feel philosophical. It felt practical and unanswered. That night, I slept lightly. Not from sadness, from alertness. The kind that comes when you realize the structure you lived inside is gone, and you don't yet know what replaces it. In the morning, I watched light move across the floor and understood something quietly. I had spent years waiting for permission. Permission to rest, permission to decline, permission to matter without contributing. Now that no permission was required, I didn't know how to stand inside it. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't free. I was unpracticed. The space I had gained was real, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like risk. I locked the cabin door, without thinking of it as refuge. Not yet. It wasn't sanctuary. It was evidence. Evidence that something had shifted, beyond repair, and that whatever came next would require a version of me I hadn't learned to be yet. I hadn't lost everything, but I had lost direction. And direction, once removed, doesn't announce what replaces it. It leaves you standing still, long enough to notice how much of yourself you had postponed for later. Later had arrived, and I didn't yet know where to put myself inside it. The quiet didn't hold. It never does. Silence has a way of making other people uneasy. Not because they miss you, but because they no longer know how to use you. The first call came sooner than I expected. Not emotional, not reflective, practical. "Mom," my daughter said, "we're trying to sort a few things out. Could you help us with something?" Intweltang, help. The word slipped into the conversation, like it always had. Familiar, unexamined. My body reacted before my mind did. That small tightening in the chest, the instinct to say yes, before understanding what was being asked. "What do you need?" I asked. She explained it quickly. Schedules. Logistics. A minor complication. Nothing unreasonable. That was the problem. "I'm not sure," I said. There was a pause. Not offended. Confused. "Oh," she said lightly. "Well, let us know." 84. Let us know. As if availability were something I had simply forgotten to confirm. After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen, longer than necessary. I hadn't said no. I also hadn't said yes. I didn't know. Which one unsettled me more? The second reach came indirectly. A text from my son. "Hey Mom, quick question. Is Didarity?" Quick questions were never quick. They were openings. Requests, framed small, so they wouldn't feel like requests at all. I stared at the screen, longer than I should have. I typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, I wrote, "I can't right now. Hedge, today." And a very for that. No explanation. My hands trembled slightly after I hit send. Not from guilt, from unfamiliarity. He responded with a thumbs up. "They've lan other in the disgram buys and the same lover, and the same lover. They've lan other in the board meeting." No follow-up. No acknowledgement. The conversation ended before it began. That stung more than I expected. Not because he was rude, but because the exchange made something clear. I wasn't being pulled back in emotionally. I was being checked for access. The requests continued over the next few days. Small, reasonable, carefully worded. Could I watch the kids for an afternoon? Could I pick something up? Could I help just this once? Each one assumed the same old shape. That I would step in. That I would absorb inconvenience. That I would make things easier without needing to be included. I noticed how none of them came with conversation. No updates. No sharing. Just need. I felt myself waver, not because I wanted to return, but because I didn't yet trust the space I had claimed. One evening, I almost called my daughter, not to argue, not to accuse, to smooth it, to make the awkwardness disappear. That urge scared me, because it felt automatic, like muscle memory. I realized how fluent I was in making discomfort vanish, even when it wasn't mine to resolve. A few days later, my daughter stopped by unannounced. She stood in the doorway, coat still on, holding a small box. "These were in the attic," she said. "Your Christmas decorations. I thought you might want them." Gesture. The box sat between us, like an offering, not generous, strategic. If I took it, I would be back in position, decorating, preparing, participating quietly. I took the box. "Thank you," I said. I didn't open it. She waited. I could feel it. The expectation that I would say more, that I would explain myself, reassure her, restore balance. I didn't. She shifted uncomfortably. "Well," she said, "I should get going." 8. I've got a answer. After she left, The house felt charged. Not calm, not heavy, unresolved. That night, I lay awake questioning myself. Was I being difficult? Was I misreading everything? Was this what growth felt like? Or was I just pulling away? There were no clear answers, only the awareness that the old pattern was no longer automatic, and the new one hadn't settled yet. I wasn't protecting peace. I didn't have peace. I was protecting space. And space, when first claimed, is fragile. It can look like distance, like coldness, like punishment. I knew that's how it might appear. I also knew I couldn't keep translating myself into a version that made everyone else comfortable at my expense. So I stayed where I was, not confident, not resolved, just present. The old shape kept trying to return, and I hadn't decided yet whether I was strong enough to stop it. It didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment anyone would later point to and say, "That's when everything went wrong." End quote. It happened quietly, which made it harder to deny. My daughter came over one afternoon to pick something up. She didn't sit down, didn't take off her coat. She stood in the kitchen, keys in her hand, already halfway gone. "We finalized Christmas plans," she said, scrolling on her phone as she spoke. Finalized, a word that doesn't invite response. I nodded. She talked about flights, about timing, about how busy things were going to be. She didn't ask me anything, not what I was doing, not where I'd be, not if I wanted to come. She spoke the way people do, when they assume something has already been decided. "So we'll be out of town for a bit," she added, almost as an afterthought. I waited. There is a certain pause you learn to recognize when you expect to be included. It didn't come. She hesitated then, just briefly. Not from concern, from calculation. "Oh," she said, "we didn't think you'd want to deal with all that travel anyway." I have crossed. Anyway, as if my absence had already been justified. She continued speaking. Before I could respond, "You always say you're fine," she said, "and it's a lot with the kids. We figured you'd rather stay home." Rather, as if this were my preference, as if exclusion had been transformed into choice. I didn't answer. Not because I was shocked, but because something clicked into place. This wasn't carelessness. This was familiarity. She wasn't guessing what I wanted. She was relying on what I had always accepted. "You're always so understanding," she added, smiling slightly, as if that settled everything. That sentence landed harder than anything else. Understanding had become the reason I no longer needed to be asked. Because people who understand don't complicate plans. They absorb them. I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to reassure her, to nod, to smile, to make this easier for everyone. I didn't. The silence stretched between us. She looked up then, surprised. "You're quiet," she said. "Yes," I replied. She laughed softly, uncomfortable. "You don't have to make this a big thing," she said. A big thing, as if my absence were already normal, and my silence was the disruption. "I'm not," I said. And I wasn't. I wasn't making anything a big thing. I was simply not fixing it. She checked the time on her phone. "I should get going," she said. "There's still so much to do." It's says. Of course there was. Life was moving forward. At the door, she paused. "You know we love you," she said, automatically. I nodded. "I know," I replied. Love wasn't the issue. Consideration was. When the door closed, the house didn't feel empty. It felt exposed, as if something I had been holding together, with habit and silence, had finally been set down. I stood there for a long moment, replaying the conversation. Not what she said, but what she didn't. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't dismissed me. She had accounted for me, and decided I wouldn't mind, decided I wouldn't ask, decided I would understand. That realization was clean, sharp, impossible to soften, I understood then that my silence had not protected me. It had trained them. I had taught them that my presence was optional, that my feelings were manageable, that my role was to adjust. And once something becomes optional, it is easy to leave it out. Nothing dramatic had happened. No relationship ended. No words were taken back. But something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because I could no longer tell myself this was a misunderstanding, or bad timing, or stress. It was clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not leave. That was the moment. I stopped wondering whether I was being excluded. I wasn't wondering anymore. I knew. And knowing changed everything. Not loudly, not all at once, but permanently. I didn't react right away. Knowing something and feeling its consequences are not the same moment. What settled first was not pain. It was certainty. The kind that doesn't argue back, doesn't look for alternative explanations, doesn't soften itself with hope. I wasn't guessing anymore. That clarity stayed with me in the days that followed. Quietly. Nothing around me changed at once. The house stayed the same. The phone stayed mostly silent. Life didn't announce that something had shifted, but I noticed it in small, ordinary ways. I stopped checking my phone, expecting an invitation. I stopped waiting to be included, not because I was angry, but because waiting no longer made sense. And that was when the losses began. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Because once you realize you are no longer considered, you begin to see what that absence costs you. There comes a moment when a person realizes that the bleeding they once believed was noble was simply habitual. Bleeding for others, bleeding for tradition, bleeding for peace, bleeding for worth. I used to think the slow drain of myself was a sign of love, that giving without pause, adjusting without complaint, and absorbing without reaction proved devotion. So when I stopped bleeding, I expected only relief. But stopping came with its own losses. Quiet losses. Unexpected losses. Losses that revealed just how deeply sacrifice had been woven into my identity. This chapter is not about what I gained. I explored those in earlier pages. This is about what I lost when I stopped bleeding, and why those losses mattered more than I anticipated. The first loss was invisibility. For years, invisibility was my armor. So long as I stayed silent, so long as I said yes, so long as I made myself small, flexible, helpful, no one questioned my feelings. No one challenged my choices. No one asked about my needs. I thought invisibility was humility, but invisibility allowed others to build comfort on top of me without ever seeing the cost. When I stopped bleeding, when I said no gently, instead of yes automatically, I lost the cloak of invisibility. And being seen was not comforting. It was unsettling, because once seen, you can no longer hide behind sacrifice. You must reveal preference. You must reveal hurt. You must reveal self. Bleeding kept me hidden. Stopping exposed me. And exposure is frightening. The second thing I lost was predictability. I was predictable when bleeding. I would help. I would host. I would attend. I would adjust, without exception. Predictability made others comfortable. It gave them certainty. They never had to ask, because they already knew I would accommodate. Stopping disrupted that. Suddenly, they had to consider me. They had to ask. They had to plan. They had to negotiate. And uncertainty unsettles. When I stopped being predictable, I became a variable instead of a constant. They didn't know whether I would say yes or no. And that shift, that tiny shift, changed the family's rhythm. Predictability was lost. Agency was gained. But the loss came first. The third loss was control, the subtle kind that hides behind helpfulness. I never wanted control outright. I didn't bark orders or command attention. But when you run holiday traditions, when you host, when you organize, when you coordinate, you hold a kind of quiet authority, not dominance, direction. When I stopped bleeding, I stopped directing, and the holiday shifted from my home to theirs, from my rituals to their preferences, from my pacing to their schedules. And I lost control, not of people, but of the narrative. I lost the comfort of knowing how things would unfold. I lost the illusion that my way was the way. Control was never the goal. I didn't crave it, but losing it revealed how much identity I had tied to steering the ship. Without control, I felt adrift. The fourth thing I lost was the comfort of martyrdom. No one likes to admit that martyrdom offers reward, but it does. When you bleed for others, you can tell yourself, I am needed, I am good, I am indispensable, I am selfless. Martyrdom gives purpose. Even when purpose is self-destructive, stopping forced me to confront a truth I didn't want to name. Some of my sacrifice was not purely love. Some of it was fear. Fear that if I stopped giving, I would stop mattering. Martyrdom had insulated me from confronting that fear. When I stopped bleeding, I lost the shield, and I had to face the vulnerability beneath it. The fifth thing I lost was assumption. I assumed I would always be central. I assumed my traditions would hold. I assumed my children valued what I valued. I assumed inclusion was guaranteed. Stopping disrupted assumption. It forced me to recognize that relationships evolve, that children become adults, not extensions of us, that holidays shift as lives shift, that my role was never meant to remain the same. Losing assumption felt like betrayal, not by them, but by time. Assumption protected me from seeing change. Without it, I had to acknowledge it. The sixth thing I lost was the comfort of silent forgiveness. Silent forgiveness is easy. It asks nothing of the other person. It protects them from discomfort. It lets you avoid conflict. When I stopped bleeding, I could no longer pretend that silence equaled grace. I recognized that forgiveness requires acknowledgement, that being hurt is not an invitation to swallow pain until it becomes bitterness. I lost the reflex to excuse thoughtlessness, and I realized how often I had forgiven without healing. Stopping forced me to face resentment. It was not pleasant, but resentment acknowledged can be released. Resentment ignored festers. The seventh loss was the illusion of irreplaceability. When you bleed, people depend on you, and dependence feels like proof of worth. But dependence is not love, it's convenience. Stopping showed me I could be replaced. Traditions continued. Holidays moved forward. Joy happened without my orchestration. And that realization was devastating. For a moment, then liberating. Because when you realize you are replaceable in tasks, you begin to understand where you are irreplaceable in love, in history, in relationship, in memory. Bleeding had made me believe I must earn irreplaceability. Stopping taught me I never could. But here is the most painful loss. I lost the illusion. That time was endless. When I stopped bleeding, I felt the weight of years. Years of putting others first. Years of silence. Years of traditions I built with my own hands that could fade or change without my permission. Stopping forced me to see time honestly, not as a series of holidays, to be repeated forever, but as a river that moves forward. And in that river, I saw myself aging. I saw my son aging, his children growing, life continuing, with or without me. Losing that illusion was not a tragedy. It was a reckoning with reality, a reckoning with impermanence. So, yes, when I stopped bleeding, I lost invisibility, predictability, and control. Martyrdom, assumption, silent forgiveness, the illusion of irreplaceability, the illusion of endless time. Those losses scraped. They stung. They humbled me. But they also cleared space. Space for truth. Space for choice. Space for autonomy. Space for identity. Space for resilience. Stopping was not an end. It was a transition. Away from roles and toward self. Away from obligation and toward dignity. Away from sacrifice and toward conscious love. Bleeding had been my language for decades. Stopping forced me to learn a new one. And in learning it, I discovered I didn't lose everything. I only lost what was holding me back from seeing what I still had. Quiet is not what I feared most. It was what I avoided naming, because when the holiday passed, when suitcases were zipped and their car pulled away and Florida swallowed their December, I was left not with drama or confrontation, but with quiet. Quiet after exclusion is different from quiet chosen. It carries weight. It echoes. It tests the walls of a home and a heart. Still, it arrived, not as punishment, but as consequence, and I had to learn how to live with it. The first days were the hardest. Morning light spilled through the curtains, not as invitation, but as reminder. No one needed me to rise early. No pancakes to flip. No stockings to fill. No wrapping paper to hide. The rituals that once marked time fell silent. I poured coffee into a single mug and sat at a table meant for gatherings. The chair across from me felt like a ghost, not of a person, but of a role I no longer occupied. Automatically, I didn't cry, not at first. Tears imply reaction. Quiet is more subtle. It settles. It lingers. It forces confrontation. Without conversation, I didn't know how to fill it. So I didn't. Not immediately. I let the quiet exist. And in doing so, I learned something unexpected. Quiet is not empty. It is unoccupied. And there is a difference. I filled my days slowly. I organized drawers that had been neglected for years. I dusted shelves without rushing. I walked through the neighborhood with no destination. At first, these routines felt like distraction, but they slowly became discovery. In those routines, I realized I had space, mental and emotional space, I hadn't known was missing. No one interrupted my thoughts. No one required negotiation. No one needed me to soften edges or cushion feelings. Quiet revealed how much energy I had spent being available, and availability, when unexamined, becomes identity. Without it, I was left with myself, not the mother self, not the holiday self, not the caretaker self, the self I had placed in the attic, next to the decorations that didn't get used this year. I had forgotten her. Quiet reintroduced us, but quiet is not always benevolent. There were nights when silence grew heavy, when memories arrived uninvited. My son's delighted squeal as he opened his first bicycle, Sarah's first Christmas with us, her nervousness melting into laughter, the children leaving cookie crumbs across my clean floors. Memory, in quiet, can turn tender or sharp. Some nights, it was both. I found myself mourning, Not just the absence of this year, but the permanence I once believed in. Quiet asked questions. That noise had hidden. Who am I? Without tradition? What is my place? When others build their own? What does love look like when it's no longer centered around holidays? Questions I had to sit with, because quiet provides no distractions. It demands attention, and yet, quiet also invited gratitude. Small gratitude, unplanned gratitude, not the kind tied to grand gestures or perfect moments. I noticed new things. The way winter light made dust sparkle as it drifted in afternoon beams, the taste of tea when I wasn't gulping it between tasks, the comfort of soft slippers on cold floors, the luxury of reading a chapter without checking the clock. These were not replacements for holiday joy. They were supplements. They reminded me that joy can be found outside of tradition. Quiet broadened the definition of fulfillment. Not all joy requires witness. Not all meaning requires audience. Living with the quiet after also revealed something delicate. Connection survived. It did not vanish with the holiday. Neighbors still waved. Friends still called. The barista still asked if I wanted cinnamon on my latte. I had convinced myself that centrality equaled belonging. Quiet challenged that. It showed me belonging is layered. Family is one layer, community another, self yet another. Quiet reminded me that being left out of a holiday did not erase me from the world. I was still here, seen, known, even if differently. Of course, there were moments when doubt visited, when I wondered if I should have protested more, asked more, said more, wondered if my boundaries looked like barriers, if my peace looked like detachment, if my silence was misunderstood. These thoughts arrived most often at night, but morning light softened them, because each new day offered proof that I could exist, not just survive, in this quieter season, not erased, not irrelevant, just evolving. And here is the truth. I didn't anticipate. Quiet became companion, not comfort, not salvation, but companion. It walked with me as I disentangled identity from tradition, as I redefined value beyond usefulness, as I learned to hold love without clutching, as I respected boundaries, mine and theirs. Quiet asked, "What do you want?" Not, "What do they expect? What do they need? What do they assume? What do you want?" It was a question I hadn't asked myself in years, perhaps decades. And in searching for answers, I began to recognize myself, not the woman they left behind, the woman I found. Living with the quiet after didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase hurt. It didn't cure loneliness. It didn't fix the past. But it created space. Space for reflection. Space for healing. Space for future conversation, unloaded of urgency and decorated with honesty. Because quiet is the breath between conflict and understanding, the stillness between assumption and clarity, the pause between who I was and who I could become. Quiet did not end the story. Quiet prepared me to write the next chapter with less fear, less assumption, less bleeding, and more awareness. Quiet was not punishment. It was transition, and learning to live with it was not defeat. It was an awakening, perhaps late, perhaps painful, but awakening still. And awakenings, no matter when they arrive, are beginnings, not endings. There are things we learn late in life because we are too busy surviving the earlier parts of it to notice what we're losing in the process. If wisdom is hindsight, then perhaps regret is simply the price of clarity. This chapter is not a confession of mistakes. It is an acknowledgement of lessons I wish I had carried sooner, not to change the past, but to soften it. Because so much of what hurt me later was shaped by what I didn't understand earlier. If I could speak to my younger self, I would begin here. Love does not require disappearing. I spent years believing that the more I sacrificed, the more I proved love. So I gave, and adjusted, and bent, and softened, and swallowed. I thought selflessness was the highest form of affection. Now I know. There is a difference between selflessness and self-erasure. One honors love, the other depletes it. I wish I had known that shrinking myself did not protect my children. It only taught them I had no boundaries, and boundaries are not barricades. They are guides. I wish I had known that silence is not grace. I thought silence preserved peace, but silence preserves ignorance. When I withheld my feelings to avoid burdening others, I also withheld truth, and truth withheld becomes misunderstanding. I wish I had learned earlier that honesty can be gentle, that discomfort is not disaster, that communication is not conflict. Had I expressed fear, uncertainty, or needs sooner, perhaps complicated would not have become code. Silence was not kindness. Silence was surrender. I wish I had understood that children do not owe us replication. I believed tradition was inheritance, passed down, like heirlooms. But traditions are chosen, not inherited. Children build lives, not as continuations of ours, but as evolutions of them. I wish I had known that letting go is not losing. It is trusting that what was meaningful once will remain meaningful, even if reimagined. I wish I had known that motherhood is not linear. It does not end. When children leave home, it does not freeze. When grandchildren arrive, it does not diminish. In distance, it changes. And that change is not proof of failure. It is proof of life. My pain began when I resisted change. My peace began when I accepted it. I wish I had known that asking for help does not weaken dignity. I carried burdens quietly because I believed strength required silence, but vulnerability is not weakness. It is honesty. I wish I had asked for more, not favors, but presence. I wish I had said, I need you, with the same courage. I used to say, I'm fine. It's rested W, because relationships deepen when needs are shared, not hidden. I wish I had understood that being needed is not the same as being valued. Need fades, value remains. When I tied my purpose to usefulness, I mistook dependence for love. But dependence is temporary. Love is enduring. If I had known sooner that my worth did not hinge on task or role, I might have entered this new season with less fear. I wish I had known that guilt is not inheritance. I carried guilt for saying no, for resting, for disappointing expectations. But guilt, I learned, is often evidence of misaligned priorities. I wish I had placed my well-being not above others, but beside theirs. Not in competition, but in balance. I wish I had known that exclusion does not equal abandonment. The first Christmas without me felt like rejection, but distance was not absence. It was transition. Had I understood that sooner, perhaps the hurt would have felt less personal, because life pulls in many directions, and love persists, even when proximity changes. I wish I had known that forgiveness is not absolution. Forgiveness does not erase what happened. It does not rewrite. It reframes. It allows pain to be acknowledged without being carried. I wish I had learned that forgiveness is not for the person who hurt you. It is for the person who must keep living with the memory. I wish I had known that it is possible to love children fiercely and still love oneself fully. It took decades to realize these two loves are not rivals. They are companions, and balance is not betrayal. I wish I had known that aging is not shrinking. Aging is unfolding. It is the season when clarity arrives, when ego loosens, when identity deepens. I feared irrelevance, but irrelevance is not destiny. It is a perception, shifted by understanding and reclaimed by choice. All these lessons arrived late, but lateness does not make them lesser. Wisdom is not graded on timing, it is measured by integration. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can say, I wish I had known earlier. Yes, but knowing now is still a gift, because it allows me to move forward with grace, not naive, not silent, not invisible, but aware of my worth, outside obligation, aware of my voice, outside sacrifice, aware of my love, outside tradition, aware of myself, not defined by roles, but supported by them. If I could go back, I would whisper all of this to my younger self, but I cannot. So instead, I offer it here, not as regret, but as reminder. It is never too late to learn, and never too late to change, and never too late to love without losing yourself. If you're listening to this, it means the story has reached you in a moment of quiet, the same kind of quiet I once feared, then lived with, then learned to understand. This is not a letter of accusation, not a plea, not a demand to rewrite the past. It is an offering, a bridge, because every family, no matter how close or fractured, lives in the space between what was meant and what was felt. And this, what you're hearing now, is the truth I could not speak when silence felt safer. If you're listening to this, I want you to know I was hurt, not destroyed, not broken, not abandoned. There is no shame in admitting that. None in acknowledging that exclusion stung, that being optional challenged my sense of place, that the word complicated echoed longer than you intended. Pain does not disappear, because intention was kind. But pain does soften when truth is seen. If you're listening to this, I also want you to know I loved you through it. Not blindly, not perfectly, not silently, but steadily. Even when I stepped back, even when I chose peace, even when boundaries formed between what I once gave and what I could no longer offer, the love remained. Love did not vanish. When traditions changed, it simply changed shape. If you're listening to this, I want to tell you something I wish I had said sooner. I understand. I understand the pull of building your own life. I understand the need to claim holidays that reflect your values, your rhythm, your family. I understand that adulthood demands multiple loyalties to spouses, to children, to in-laws, to jobs, to rest. I understand that the center of a family shifts with time, and I understand that you did not mean to hurt me. Intention matters, so does impact. We carry both. But understanding is the beginning of reconciliation. If you're listening to this, I need you to know I forgive you. Not because I forgot, not because I erased the ache, not because forgiveness is owed. I forgive because resentment cannot be home, because bitterness poisons memory, because love deserves cleaner soil. Forgiveness is not absolution, it is release. And I release you from guilt, from expectation, from the weight of my silence. If you're listening to this, I also want you to hear, I forgive myself for staying silent, for bleeding too long, for tying my worth to usefulness, for assuming you understood without explanation, for shrinking, for waiting instead of speaking, for being afraid to admit that I wanted to be wanted. Self-forgiveness is not vanity. It is permission to grow. If you're listening to this, please understand, I do not want to go back, not to old roles, not to unquestioned traditions, not to centrality built on obligation. I do not want to reclaim the past. I want to honor it and build forward. not identically, not resentfully, not demandingly, collaboratively, with choices, with conversation, with shared traditions, old and new. If you're listening to this, I hope you hear one truth. Above all, I am still here, not as a martyr, not as a shadow, not as the keeper of rituals whose value expired. I am here, as a woman, with a life beyond holidays, a grandmother, with laughter still to offer, a mother, with insight earned, through both pride and pain, a person, worthy of space, even outside, of usefulness. I am here, and I hope you will meet me here, not in the past, not in guilt, in the present, where conversations can happen without defensiveness, where love can be expressed without expectation, where time together is chosen, not owed. If you're listening to this, I hope you understand something I learned late. We do not outgrow family. We evolve with it. We make room for new histories. We allow distance without defeat. We create traditions that breathe. We forgive. We remain, not as we were, as we are, and if you are willing, as we could become. If you're listening to this, I want you to know one final thing. I am proud of you, for the life you built, for the independence you claimed, for the family you nurture, for the courage to grow. My hurt does not erase my pride. My boundaries do not diminish my love. My absence from one holiday does not negate a lifetime of presence. I am proud, and I hope you are not afraid to be proud of me too, not for what I gave, but for who I am. If you're listening to this, I am here, still loving, still learning, still willing, not from the center, not from the margins, from a place of mutual respect, from a place of understanding, from a place of peace I fought hard to find. If you're listening, come sit with me, not in obligation, not in apology, in recognition, in choice, in love. It's not too late. It never was.